backtracking before that to get the full picture, which is that the ecology movement had started, way back when, basically middle of the 19th century, when people began to really show some concerns for the depredations being inflicted on the world around us. And it has a long history from that time forward, mostly under the rubric of conservation, and it's really in the late 50s and early 60s where that sort of reaches its zenith. And then you get to the mid-60s and suddenly it begins to change its spots, because you have the Vietnam War dumping vast amounts of chemicals onto the poor country of Vietnam through the form of Agent Orange. And you have the nuclear crisis, which has already been percolating by then since Hiroshima, but in particular in the 1950s during atmospheric nuclear testing, in which women's milk, breast milk, was found to have strontium-90 and a number of other horrifying radioactive components due to the fact that radiation had been spewed into the atmosphere all over the world. And so you had a ban on atmospheric testing as a major goal of the original anti-nuclear movement in the late 50s. And then you have this kind of revulsion against the heavy chemicals being inflicted on the world in the beginning, in the early 60s, with largely thanks to Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, where she decried the fact that agricultural fields that had once been multi-species and multifaceted and dynamic and abundant had become essentially death zones in which only one thing could grow, because they used heavy chemicals to make sure that everything else died. And so that kind of awareness began to percolate out from those various researchers and campaigners to the larger population. Their forces gather their friends and neighbors to come together and start to discuss things in a more comprehensive way than had been done before, even the already rejecting what had passed for ecological activism up to that moment as being too narrow. And so, even though some of it had really become quite a lot broader in the previous era, right before they did this. So then in 1975, the first meeting started to happen, and the interesting thing was that they really were trying to, as Judy put it to me, they were trying to figure out where they were. And that's what the purpose of the original meetings were, was a group of 20 or 30 people meeting at the farm, just down creek from us. If you think of this whole slope leading to the Precita Creek underneath was then Army and it's now Cesar Chavez, and going right down past the farm, and then into the Islas Creek wetlands on the other side of Bernal Heights over there and Potrero Hill over there. There's a giant wetland over there until the 1930s. So that farm was an auspicious place for them to meet, and it was a place that had been set up by Bonnie Shirk, who used to live right at the back of this street here, and Jack Wicker, who lived in a houseboat down on Mission Creek. They founded the farm by the freeway, and thousands of children passed through there and held little chickies and petted the goats and had all these kind of farm-like experiences, and their ecological sensibilities were expanded just by that. And then meanwhile, it became a place that was easy to rent and easy to use for all sorts of activist and thoughtful groups, whether it's Pickle Family Circus rehearsing there, or in fact the Frisco Bay Mussel Group having their regular meetings there starting in 1975. They met every 2 weeks for the next 3 years. And during that first year and a half or so, the big focus was on figuring out where are we, what is this place, and what are the components of it. And so one of the, by the way, if you want to read about this, I just put an article on foundsf.org, our website, which is part of Shaping San Francisco. It's the digital archive of Shaping San Francisco. My name is Chris Carlsson, if anybody didn't know. So you can read all about this later if you didn't follow the rapid oral presentation that I'm giving you. But the interesting thing is that they come up with a whole series of things to try to focus on, to understand better where we are, and then eventually set out a series of kind of goals from that new knowledge that they developed. I'm going to figure out how to get all this stuff in my head here. At the second meeting in 1975, topics were identified for further research and ultimate action, and ultimately people would take on a topic or research item and go off and research it and come back and make a presentation at a later meeting. That was sort of this DIY grassroots think tank kind of experience that they created out of nothing, really. So they wanted to, these are the things they set out to do: a county by county analysis of land available for gardens and farms. This is like for the larger Bay Area as a whole, because they were already thinking regionally, because the premise, the fundamental political assumption of the sort of the movement that was part of, was to really reconfigure ourselves in terms of bioregions. We all know that Planet Drum is really the kind of instigator of that sensibility. And Frisco Bay Mussel Group starts with a bioregional sensibility, and that means thinking about things in terms of watersheds. But of course, when you think about watersheds in the Bay Area, it's not a small thing, because we have lots and lots of tiny little creeks and wells and artesian springs all over the place. But if you start thinking about how they integrate with each other, the bay is a sort of central piece of it, with the delta being its upper respiratory system, if you will, and then an enormous number of giant rivers that once upon a time fed directly into the delta, and of course have been plumbed by the insanity of modern life mostly in the 20th century. And so that California now has the most bizarre plumbing system ever invented in the world and ever built. And it's very fragile, and it may or may not last that much longer, but in any case, that's what we have today. So the delta itself is under constant pressure and constant duress, which we'll come back to in a moment. But in this beginning of this process, with the idea of watershed as a central concern, a county-by-county analysis of land available for gardens and farms, a para or meta agency to monitor existing government agencies and industries for relevant information. So kind of like seeing what you could get out of the things that were around already. Researching the alteration of building codes to facilitate rooftop gardens, graywater reuse, solar generation, and heating. Land restoration projects. Step-by-step transformation plan for San Francisco on 10, 20, and 50-year timelines. Okay, it's 50 years. Did we do it? Did we do it? A little bit. Identification of relic habitats with public and protected access. And as if you were at the Greg Garr show last night, you'll notice that a lot of what he focused on were those remnant habitats that still exist, that the Division of Natural Resources is now responsible for in the Rec and Park Department. A study of 85,000 acres of diked tidelands to plan removal of levees and restoration of wetlands. Support aquaculture, mussels for food, cordgrass for fiber and grain. So there's, thinking creatively about like what could we do to reconnect our lives to this once abundant resource, i.e. the bay. It's right there. Research tax resistance, since local and federal taxes are used to destroy land. Design a food distribution system and organize people to do it. Garden Corps, well-paid people to reclaim free abandoned lands for urban gardens. And then adding new sewage lines for graywater. And a block-by-block compost collection and trash sorting. So these are the ideas that they were just thinking, like, wouldn't this be grand? And then now we can stop and pause 50 years later and realize like an awful lot of these things have either happened or are in the works. So obviously block-by-block compost pickup, for all of its flaws, for ecology, is far from perfect and far from what we would do if we were doing it ourselves. But they do in fact pick up the compost on a house-by-house, block-by-block basis as the routine policy of the city. That was unheard of and almost unimaginable when they first laid this vision out. If you think about the salt ponds all over the South Bay, a great number of those have already been breached and are now been returned to wetlands and are part of the Don Edwards National Wildlife Reserve, which didn't exist 50 years ago either. So that's another example of kind of progress in that. I would mention that 50 years ago, it was 2 years after the passage of the Clean Water Act, so the bay itself was still a sewage pit. I mean, you went down by the water. Today, you go down because it's a desirable place to be. You want to go by the bay. It's beautiful water. It's great. 50 years ago, it smelled like shit, literally, because it was full of shit. Because every single municipality around the bay was dumping raw sewage into the bay, and it took a long time, years, to rebuild the sewage systems throughout the Bay Area so that you actually had secondary treatment of sewage, which is these things you see like the East Bay Municipal Utility District on the other side of the Bay Bridge, that large sewage treatment facility. We're now once again rebuilding our sewage facility down in the Bayview Hunters Point area, a massive facility down there. But that's only secondary treatment, and we've never ever addressed tertiary treatment, which is actually all the kinds of pharmaceuticals and chemicals and other things that go into the water down people's toilets and from industry, more from industry than anywhere else. That is also contaminating the bay and contaminating the cycles of life up and down the chain of existence. It's interesting to just think about like the gardening system we have now. I mean, Lisa Ruth works at the Alamany Farm on a regular basis. There's a 2.5 acre farm producing tons and tons of food every year. And there's over 100 community gardens around the city. In 1973, there was about 5. And it was was a vision that people had to actually expand that, and that's a whole other story in itself that took place independently with this, originally the founding of the San Francisco League of Urban Gardeners in 1980, and then its eventual demise in 2003 thanks to Willie Brown and his corrupt administration. And then the reemergence of this SFGROW, the San Francisco Gardeners Resource Organization, and the Garden for the Environment on 7th Avenue. That's all part of this volunteer effort to actually make urban agriculture a reality in the city of various types. Now, it's not all like agricultural production oriented, but some of it is. Like Alameda Farm certainly is. And many of these urban gardens are at least incredibly great demonstration pilot projects for what we could do. Because what we don't remember is that at the end of World War II, when there had been a victory garden program put in place by the federal government or encouraged by the federal government and widely adopted throughout the country, we had 70,000 victory gardens just in San Francisco. And on a national basis, 45% of all the fresh vegetables and fruit were being grown in cities. 45%. Today it's less than 3%. So we could easily reconfigure urban life to grow a great deal of food if that was our goal. And it certainly should be, given the climate change and all the other stuff that's going on right now. The graywater system that gets mentioned here is an interesting example too, because graywater has been actually built into Mission Bay, the newest neighborhood in San Francisco, because of the Alliance for a Clean Waterfront, who were activists dealing with water questions and shoreline questions and the Mission Creek and the various other ecological restoration efforts. And so they insisted that as Mission Bay was being thought of and designed, that they would build in from the get-go a third plumbing system for graywater, a capture and reuse. Now that got built in. There are purple lines throughout the entirety of all the modern buildings in the UCSF and the Mission Bay area. But there's nowhere for that water to go, because San Francisco has only on its agenda to eventually build a graywater treatment facility somewhere, theoretically, hi David, somewhere down in Bayview, Hunters Point, which of course angers the neighbors down there, because they get all the dirty tech, all the dirty facilities, dirty industry, all ends up down there. Why have the facility there? I mean, maybe a graywater facility wouldn't be physically that dirty to run, but it's unknown. To be determined. But there have been graywater projects instigated in lots of small buildings, sort of independently and off the books. I think the zoning regulations are still a little bit complicated to do those in a lot of urban environments, but in some places they've managed to do it, in Berkeley and also in parts of San Francisco. I think certain people have managed to build them into their own buildings. Of course, we see rooftop solar is widely used now. Rooftop gardening a little bit, not so much. It may not be the most practical use of roofs, but maybe in some cases it's a good idea. Certainly the Academy of Sciences has a roof garden, but last time I looked it was pretty dried out.
That's a living roof, that's not a roof garden.
No. Okay. So anyway, that's the kind of stuff that I wanted to mention about that. The other thing was about food. Well, right when they started this in '73 was sort of the takeoff point from the moving from food conspiracies, which were very widespread in that moment, where households banded together not only within the building, within the units, but many times multiple buildings on a block or in a given neighborhood, and then would participate in essentially a version of a buying club where they would delegate individuals in those groups to go shopping, usually at the Alameda Farmers Market down here, or in some cases driving out to the farms in the Central Valley or the near area farm areas, and buy large amounts of produce and bring it back and then divide it up and then redistribute it amongst the participants in those households. And those conspiracies were widespread. There were hundreds and hundreds of houses that were part of that in that era. And then right in the early 70s, some folks decided that that wasn't really serving the working class, because you had to be on welfare or have a trust fund or something like that to have time to do all that stuff. And so they wanted to create a system of stores and services that would meet the needs of the working classes, very much driven by a very left-wing ideology at the time. And so they created a series of stores, and Rainbow Grocery was briefly part of that, although it was founded by an ashram and later withdrew from the People's Food System before it completely collapsed in 1978. But Other Avenues is another piece of that story. Veritable Vegetables was the key distribution hub for that whole thing. They eventually privatized and got bought out by several of the women who were working there. entrepreneurs, Mendy Bakery. There's all these different examples of cheese board in Berkeley. There's a great number of things that have descended from that era that are still with us in some respects. And certainly the transformation in our food is more thorough and more complete than the mere existence of a small number of cooperatively run grocery stores, which have a very bad ending, which you can read about on foundsf.org if you want to go and dive into it. John Curl has just recently written the history of the People's Food System, an unbelievably detailed account of the internal politics of different collectives and the relationship between collectives amongst each other, and how much the politics ended up, undercutting what they were out to do, and of course the larger dynamics of market life and capitalism, and how difficult it is to run a small business, no matter how cooperatively you design it, et cetera, et cetera. Read that, get the full story. But the idea that food got transformed by these initiatives is undisputable, because you got that era. People started after between what I mentioned earlier with the Farm Workers Union going to, into people's right face to face in parking lots all over the country, supporters of the Farm Workers Union. People realizing during that era, the late 60s, that they don't want food soaked in chemicals. They want food that tastes better. This food wrapped in plastic is shit. I don't want to eat this. I want food that's fresh and delicious. I want it grown locally. I want it organic. So then you started going to the first organic stores, and you get these little tiny little knobby apples full of worms, and those are organic, so you should buy them, but they're not really that appealing. And so that was sort of the earliest days of that moment. But it made it clear there's a market demand here, and capitalism, if nothing else, is extremely absorbing, and will absorb absolutely every initiative that comes along, no matter what. And sure enough, different entrepreneurs decided to take advantage of that that moment, and eventually, to make a long, complicated story short, you end up with a whole paycheck dominating the world with their piles of pornographically perfect produce, and it's mostly organic officially, but it's a capitalist nightmare. So there you go. It did happen that we changed how we eat, and of course the food we eat generally in San Francisco is incredibly good. We live pretty darn well in that regard. But the notion that alone was a sort of mechanism to change everything about everyday life is not likely. Didn't turn out that way. So back to the story of the Frisco Bay Mussel Group. After this kind of endeavor over several years, and there's much to say about the details of what they learned from each other and the ways of experiences unfolded. But because they were focused on the larger experience of the watershed of the Delta, especially the Delta and its relationship to San Francisco Bay, they became aware of the fact that Jerry Brown, as the governor at the time in his early terms, was plotting this notion of building a peripheral canal. Today we call it the Delta Tunnels. And so if you have not heard all the details, I'll just briefly say that the plan then and now was to divert a great deal more fresh water from this upper Sacramento, or above the city of Sacramento, from the Sacramento River around the Delta in new kind of canals, either built on the surface, or more recently the plan is to build tunnels that are 20-foot square, that can hold 3 lanes of car traffic, go for 40 miles along the side of the Delta, along the eastern side of the foothills of the Sierra, underground, and take fresh water from the rivers and divert it down into the canals that already exist, the California Aqueduct, etc., and send it down to essentially the Resnicks, for all intents and purposes, this couple that runs the pistachio business and the pomegranate business and the mandarin orange business. So your cuties, your palm juice, all that stuff. This one couple who's very close friends with Dianne Feinstein and gets an enormous amount of free water out of the state of California every year, and has become multi-billionaires in the process. But other people, other agribusiness interests are down there. There's a lot of billboards all over the southern part of the Sacramento River saying, "Don't waste our water," meaning letting water go through the Delta and out to the bay and out to the ocean, as though that were a waste, because you're not using it for agriculture. And so you have this kind of endless debate between the left and the right, especially in agricultural California. And the peripheral canal is the kind of key element for them to take more water from the north and bring it to the south, some of which would end up presumably in Los Angeles' water system as well, and potentially further south. And of course, water is in dire, we have dire problem with fresh water, there's no doubt about that, but whether this is a sensible solution or not, pretty obviously not. And one of the major arguments they made in the recent past, and they made it with the original peripheral canal concept as well, is that this is a seismic defense. This is going to protect us from an earthquake, because the truth is that if there's a major earthquake on the Hayward Fault, which there's going to be, it's a 65% chance, according to seismologists, and it could happen right now. It didn't. It could have. Could happen right now. It didn't. Could have. So when that happens, there's going to be a major shaking, and the chances are that the bridges will go and the freeways will go, and the delta will go, because the delta is pretty close to the Hayward Fault, and it's very old. It was built by Chinese laborers with wheelbarrows in the 1850s and 1860s, and those huge earthen barriers that hold the rivers inside of channels and allow you to have below sea level agricultural islands in the delta will quickly become an inland sea. And all that salt water will go rushing in, and 900,000 acres will fill with salt water that currently have fresh water going through to the California aqueduct. And there will no longer be fresh water available to the California aqueduct when that happens. And so that's why they want to build a canal or a tunnel, is to make sure there's fresh water that can go around all that. That's their argument. But you can make up your own mind. It's absurd. It's a ridiculous thing. But the worst part of it is that if you do divert all that fresh water, additionally than what they already do, the premise is that there's enough, fresh water to do that. There really isn't. There's been a steady decrease in the amount of fresh water, the amount of snowfall that's only going to keep happening over the coming decades. So back to the Frisco Bay Mussel Group, they had the foresight to recognize what an ecological disaster that was going to be. And they decided, let's call this representatives. Let's do all that kind of boring stuff where you get involved with government lobbying and activate as many people as we can. And they got involved with some different people were doing that kind of stuff, and even going to Sacramento and talking to politicians and everything else. And then they ended up taking out that full-page ad. Chronicle. This was a big deal. The group got together and decided to raise the funds and pay for this giant full-page ad with all these coupons at the bottom. And one of them was actually directed at the Sierra Club, because the Sierra Club was cutting a deal with the politicians to say, yeah, we'll support your canal if you'll just give us a deal on protecting some of the rivers in the far north and don't attach them to the California water system. And it was a bad compromise in the works. So they published this thing, and it led to an outcry. It really did galvanize the public, and the public sent in these coupons, and it galvanized politicians to take a position against it. It actually forced the Brown administration to back off on their original efforts to just jam it through the legislature and eventually bring it to a discussion with the, thanks, Joel, bring it to a ballot proposition in 1982. Famously, giant campaign ensued, and it failed. It was defeated by Northern Californians and even by a great number of Southern Californians who got the message that it was going to cost them a lot of tax money to build this insane system. And so as a result, the peripheral canal died. And then when Jerry Brown came back to power in 2010, the first thing he wants to do is start building the Delta tunnels. This guy's just obsessed with this, and it's partly because, there is an argument to be made for it, as I just articulated. If you want to deal with the seismic problem, that's at least one way to address it if you believe in that kind of engineering. But his father made his name and is well known to us all for two main things: the California water system that he was presided as governor for 2 terms over, building most of the Oroville Dam and a great number of the canals going south through the state. That was all under his regime when they had a lot of money. And he also built the California State University system, and his 3-tiered system. So that was Pat Brown's contribution to California, which was a legacy of important infrastructure that allowed us to have much of the life we've had, for better and for worse. But his son, Jerry, never quite managed to achieve the same level of infrastructural imprint on the state. And it seems that this peripheral canal idea is his lasting effort. Even to this day, he's no longer in power, and he's not going to be around that much longer. But Gavin Newsom continues to carry the torch for the idea of at least one tunnel being built and going around the Delta, but it has not managed to get through the state legislature. And thanks to the Frisco Bay Mussel Group. It really is. If you go back in time, you realize that started a kind of series of cascading sensibilities that have carried all the way through to the present, that still makes it very unlikely that this thing will ever get built. At one point, maybe 1977, 78, it seemed like a no-brainer that it was going to go through. So that's, I think, maybe their lasting legacy more than any other single thing, other than this larger point that I already made, is that it was a group that brought together some real interesting heavyweights in various capacities, and then together they really tried to rethink who we are, where we are, what we're doing together, and created a sensibility that lets us have a picnic today, amongst other things. So, any questions, comments, additions, subtractions, denunciations? You could read the article. It's a little bit more informative than my blathering was, but
it sounds like they had a lot.
Thinking nuclear power is part of the solution. It is not. Let me just make that abundantly clear. Nuclear power is the problem, not a solution. It is the dumbest way ever invented to boil water, and it leaves an incredible toxic legacy in every part of its production and maintenance and use. So don't let anybody talk you into that one.
Another question.
Yeah.
Did they have any impact or direct relationship with Public Citizen and Ralph Nader's Raiders and all that?
I don't think so, but Judy might have some knowledge about that.
With Ralph Nader as well?
The Nader's Raiders and Public Citizen and.
No, I think that was a little after.
Okay.
Yeah, again, when I looked at when I got, and Eric was here earlier, Eric Noble, who took the notes at all the meetings back then, and they're really kind of fun to look at, but they're, some of them are very detailed and almost like too TMI. You don't need to know so many little details about what happened in the meeting, but other times you really get a sense of the flow of the group. And of course, the focus of it ended up taking a lot of time and energy on this peripheral canal. The other thing that took a lot of time and energy was to trot out and announce the existence of that beautiful watershed poster, which you can have a copy of today if anybody wants one, and also the Living Here pamphlet, which was a culmination of all that knowledge. You have those two?
No, it's right in front of you.
It's right there. What do you know? Living Here. And so that pamphlet is a nice little summary. It's also on Found SF now if you want to read it online. That was a great summary of that work that they spent 2 years doing, of all that kind of rethinking the different aspects of our everyday lives and how we reproduce ourselves in this particular area. And that pamphlet does a nice job of capturing all that experience.
Are we talking dozens of people? 5 people?
There was some meeting notes seem to have 20 to 30 people at those meetings.
Yeah.
There it is.
So the point is, there's numbers on here, 1 through 20 or so, and in the guide, it tells you what each of those places is. So you can go visit it. And it's just, again, learning about how to live in your place. And, moving forward now, we could do a whole other living here update and learn more about our place and bring certain things into focus. Some that have been saved and recovered and some that need help.
Yeah. I mean, it's worth mentioning that there's a lot of groups around now that didn't exist back then. Like this, for instance, the San Francisco Estuary Institute has been doing what they call, I guess, is it called forensic ecology, where they go back into the old coastal survey maps from the very beginning of the United States and look at the original wetlands and shorelines of the entire Bay Area and try to rebuild a proper map of what that was, and then how it changed over time, and then the view of what it is today, and then what might be done to begin to strip back some of the worst kind of modifications of the shoreline to bring it back into natural processes.
That project is called Hidden Nature, and it's not just using the USGS maps, it's using diary accounts, it's using photographs, it's using all sorts of historic documents to piece together what landscapes were where and what foliage, flora, fauna was found where, and it is an immense resource that you can really do an overlay of today's San Francisco. They've only done the northern half of our peninsula, and then they're steadily working on the southern half.
Thank you. There's also, Save the Bay has been around since the mid-'60s, and they do a lot of good work. Bay Keepers and other organizations. There's a lot of groups doing good work around the Bay. Joel Pomerantz is doing Seep City and is doing a lot of great work on the water of San Francisco. So if you're curious where the actual original waterways were and where they are today and how they relate to the shape of the city, both physically and mentally, nobody's better to help you out in figuring that out than Joel. And he's been leading lots of recent walks for Planet Drum, and he's going to be giving a talk and a walk for us too. And he's got shower curtains, so if you want a shower curtain, he's your guy. There it is, all the original water of San Francisco, and then
That's
and
cool.
today's shoreline superimposed. Handmade, no less.
Well,
So-
he didn't draw it.
I did.
Not, yeah.
I painted it in Photoshop. I actually did.
I just mean you didn't actually draw it onto that particular shower curtain.
So I just lastly I'll just mention is that we're happy to be sharing a joint birthday party today with Planet Drum, Planet Drum obviously is 50 years old this year, and we are Shaping San Francisco 25 years old this year. And when we started our project, we actually were already very influenced by Planet Drum without being super conscious about it. I mean, I was a little conscious about it because I had met Judy and Peter. I'd been invited to one of their lunches with the people
Staff
who were working
lunches. Staff lunches. We
staff
had
lunches,
staff
yeah, regular staff lunches over there on 30th and Harper. And I went over there not knowing what to expect. I might tell this story again at the library next week, so if you're coming there, close your ears. But it was funny because I was part of the beginning of Critical Mass, me and Joel and a few other people who helped launch that back then. And then I went to this lunch with two of them, Dave Cohen and Dave Snyder. So the three of us show up there as bicyclists, interested in the concept of green city, because we knew the Planet Drum was pushing that pretty hard at that point, and we'd heard about it. And so we get there and we sit down for lunch, and it all start off having a pleasant moment, and then Peter and I start talking. Peter Berg, who has passed away now, and then I said to him, I said, look, I think this is pretty great stuff, but how can you talk about a green city without talking about all the idiotic work that's going on down there in downtown? Like, all that work is destroying the planet, and not to mention the city. So like, you can't just talk about converting it, you got to get rid of it. And he's like, what are you, a Marxist? And then he kind of got really mad at me for about 10 minutes. And he really felt like I was in the wrong place. And then after a while it mellowed out and everything got fine. And we had a pleasant rest of the time, and it turned out okay in the end. But the truth is that Shaping San Francisco was founded at the very beginning of its existence, originally after we got over the fantasy that we were going to be a game on CD-ROMs, which was the first thing we were doing. We knew that the main issue was sort of this relationship between work and ecology. So in that regard, I feel like we were influenced by Planet Drum, because Planet Drum had already made central the same kinds of questions, even during this Frisco Bay Mussel Group time, of thinking about how we produce life in this place. And that involves work, whether you want to call it that or not. And that work then has an ecological consequence, but it's also shaped by the ecology in which it interacts. And so that sensibility was a founding principle of Shaping San Francisco as we began to approach the question of how do we understand the history of this place. And you can never separate the dynamic relationship between work and ecology, between the work that made the mess and the mess that we're trying to undo with the work we're doing now. And then, of course, all the different human populations that have come together and fell apart and have contested with each other to occupy this place in various capacities, friendly and otherwise, over the years. And so that I appreciate that history, because I feel like, okay, then we really get a sense of the continuity between their 50 years and our 25 years, and the way they both overlap and reinforce each other, and sometimes add new dimensions to each of our work. So thank you for that.
A couple of things I'd like to add.
Yeah, do you want this thing? They
No,
might be able to hear you
no,
better.
Not that much. The road on the peripheral canal, the population in Northern California is much smaller, was at that time, than the population in Los Angeles and Southern California. And the only way that peripheral canal was defeated is because 99% of people in Northern California voted against it. So that was everybody, all over Northern California. That was pretty interesting. And this map, the numbered things, the reinhabitation sites, there's only 10 of them. And there also are endangered species, ghostly species, they said. So it's an interesting map because a lot of those groups still exist today. And really, what Planet Drum's been working with is, who are you, where are you, what are you going to do about it? And also, Peter wrote a really amazing article called More Than Just Saving What's Left, which is thinking bioregionally, putting the environment at the center of society, because actually we're supported by nature and we need to support nature. So it's not a new concept. This is an old concept. This is the way indigenous people live here.